Hello and welcome to day 2 of Quarantini. I'm Dr. Eric Cervini. If you're joining me for the first time, Quarantini is an LGBTQ plus book and film club for the quarantine era, an era which hopefully will be over soon. But until then, I figured I would share some of my favorite historically oriented pieces of deviant culture. I should note that I am a gay historian rather than a film or literature expert. So I like to treat the things that I assign as pieces of history, primary sources that shed light on the past and where we come from. And one of the reasons I've decided to assign fiction, even though I'm a historian, is that it allows us to leave the world that we live in, which I have to say is pretty dark right now. So it lets us grab a glass of wine and curl up under a blanket and forget about the craziness of today's world. As Phil W. emailed me, he said it's like an act of mindfulness, which I think we all deserve right now. So even if you don't have time to read the first chapter, consider just reading a few pages or starting it this weekend. I post all these videos on my website at quarantini.lgbt, so you can go at your own pace. And last night, I assigned the first chapter of one of my favorite novels of all time, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. If you haven't read it and you want to read it, then I would suggest stopping the video now and go read that first chapter. I posted a PDF of it on my site at quarantini.lgbt. And if you don't think you'll have time to read it or you've already read it, I'll give a short recap of every chapter in my videos. So, chapter 1 of Giovanni's Room. We meet the narrator, an American guy named David, who is staring contemplatively out of this window in the south of France. We find out that he had proposed to his girlfriend named Hella, but now she's mysteriously on a boat back to America. And we also learn that David has been having an affair with a man named Giovanni. Are those two things related? We'll find out. Now, we also learn a bit about his family in Brooklyn, including an alcoholic father. And we also learn that Giovanni was not the first male that David has been with. We find out when he was younger, he had actually had an intimate experience with a boy named Joey. But it's just a one-time thing, and he actually ends up being somewhat cruel to Joey. And of that experience, he says in the book, "A cavern opened in my mind, black, full of rumor, suggestion of half-hearted, half-forgotten, half-understood stories, full of dirty words." And since that experience, he's been running. And he alludes to the fact that running from this part of his identity, is what made him leave America for Paris in the first place. Now, we don't really know why Hella, his perhaps fiance or girlfriend, is on her way back to America. But we know one other piece of information from this chapter. Giovanni, his male lover, has been executed by a guillotine. Why? We don't know yet. So our discussion question was, how does James Baldwin portray race and sexuality in this first chapter? So thank you to everyone who emailed. I asked about race and sexuality because these are two very important parts of Baldwin's identity. He is both black and gay in a time when life was very difficult for anyone who identified as either of those things. Remember a bit of history for you. President Eisenhower was in power largely because of his campaign promises in 1952 saying, "Let's clean house," and his promises to remove communists and homosexuals from the government. And this book was published in 1956, the same year as Rosa Parks's Montgomery bus boycott. So a lot of you responded saying that they didn't really see race in this chapter. JH emailed me saying, "I don't see any colors. I was so absorbed in the characters and their actions." And that's true. This book is not about race. But because we don't see race, that doesn't mean that it's not important. After all, we do know that race was very important to Baldwin. His very first novel was entirely about his life as a young black man in Harlem. So let's take a second look at this chapter and look at the very first paragraph of the book. He says, "My reflection is tall, perhaps rather like an arrow. My blonde hair gleams. My face is like a face you have seen many times. My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains until they came to an ocean which faced away from Europe into a darker past." So, what does that tell us? Well, he's blonde, so he's white. And not only that, but here Baldwin is acknowledging the history of what it means to be white. The history of everything that we've talked about on Instagram and Facebook in my videos about white colonizers coming and exterminating Native Americans along with their very, very progressive gender norms. So here we have a black author writing about a white protagonist. So why did he do that? Well, later Baldwin explains. He said, "I certainly could not possibly, not in that point in my life, handle the other great weight, the Negro problem. The sexual moral light was a hard thing to deal with. I could not handle both propositions in the same book. There was no room for it," he said. So it goes to show that sexually deviant people of color, just like James Baldwin, and just like now, had two parts of their identity that triggered the disdain of the world around them. That is their race and their sexuality. And Baldwin made the choice to isolate just one of those parts of his identity. So he made the protagonist this white guy from Brooklyn. And so that way, race isn't really a big deal in this book because the narrator has the ability to ignore his race. So that brings us to the second half of our discussion, sexuality. As Mark H. put it in his email, "I often felt like David's self-discovery was something he wanted to avoid. He escapes the US to find himself, only to eventually learn that the self I was going to find would turn out to be only the same self from which I had spent so much time in flight." And so this book is clearly the story of David running away from acknowledging his sexuality, only to find that he was actually running towards it. And one passage that I thought as a historian that was particularly interesting was his reference to his time in the military. He said that he had one interaction, maybe romantic, with, and I'm quoting here, "a fairy who was later court-martialed out. The panic his punishment caused in me was as close as I ever came to facing in myself the terrors I sometimes saw clouding another man's eyes." End quote. This is the only time he refers to an identity, the fairy. He doesn't call himself a homosexual or a bisexual. And in fact, other historians like George Chauncey, he's the author of Gay New York, have identified that the fairy was its own very self-conscious category all the way back at the beginning of the 20th century. And the fact that Baldwin is using that term in connection with the army punishing the fairy for sexual deviance sheds a good deal of light on another phenomenon discovered by historians like Margot Canaday, who wrote The Straight State, another wonderful book. When governments persecute minorities, they help contribute to the identity formation of that minority. In other words, when that fairy was punished for being gay, other people in his unit, just like the protagonist here, maybe men who hadn't confronted their own sexualities, began to think of themselves in terms of or in relation to that fairy. So in a very odd, paradoxical way, the persecution of homosexuals allowed us to realize, hey, maybe I am gay and maybe I'm part of a larger group. So today's assignment is chapter 2 of Giovanni's Room. And our discussion question is, how does the gay world of Paris in the 1950s compare to the gay world of today? And I want to make sure everyone has time to read these two chapters. So we're not going to discuss this chapter, the second chapter, until Monday. But I will be on tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern with a bonus assignment for our very fast readers. So don't forget to tune in then, and also to send your responses. You have all weekend to do it, to quarantini@ericcervini.com. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to check out our website at quarantini.lgbt if you need to get caught up on the assignments or check out my other videos. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow. I'm Dr. Eric Cervini, and this was Quarantini.